Lights on so we can start. I'm Scott Loveridge. I'm Director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and I'm pleased to be your session moderator today. We do have the chat box open, and so if participants have questions as the webinar progresses, please enter your questions into the chat box. I will be monitoring that so I can alert our presenters if you've got questions or you'd like clarifications or if you have comments. We've got a couple of great speakers today. Mark Partridge is the Swank Chair of Rural Urban Policy at Ohio State University. He's co-editor of the Journal of Regional Science and also co-editor of the new Springer Briefs in Regional Science, and serves on 7 other academic editorial boards. He's published over 100 scholarly papers and co-authored the book Geography of American Poverty: Is There a Role for Place-Based Policy? Professor Partridge has received research funding from many sources, including the National Science Foundation. His research includes investigating rural-urban interdependence and regional growth and policy. His co-author here, Rose Olfert, is Professor of Public Policy at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. Professor Olfert serves on several editorial boards and has published widely in community and rural economic development. Her research on place-based policy, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, has involved collaborative work in Latin American countries as well as Europe. Regional economic cooperation and appropriate policy responses for subnational economic development have been common themes of her research. So welcome, Mark and Rose, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Scott, for inviting Rose and I to give this presentation. Let me just give you a little bit of an overview of how we'll proceed here. Basically, I'll do a very brief introduction. Then Rose will pick up from there for a while. Then I will speak for a longer time period, and Rose will conclude. And in this, I think a lot of what we'll be talking about today is relatively well known by people who do regional economic development and community development. However, I think that we're going to add something that how to engage stakeholders, how to engage policymakers, and to try to better inform them about how policy should be developed. And in that, I think one of our lessons is that it's do no harm. Is that the first rule should be is don't do harm to your local economy. And I think all of us would agree that in the last 20 years we've seen a deterioration in how local economic development policy has been done, and a lot of that has to do with policymakers and economic development officials really don't want to bring experts to the table. In a lot of cases, I don't think they want to hear what we're going to say. They know what we're going to say. And how can we get back engaged with that so we can actually say, hey, just stop doing harm? I think so that would be probably our key lesson today is do no harm. But in that, a little bit of an overview. To first, Rose is going to, in a minute, give a little bit of discussion about how regions have evolved. I know a lot of this is well known, but I think it's going to frame a context for how we're then going to talk about policy. And the first is that, as I've already alluded to, is current economic development policy is just not particularly effective. In an environment where we really need job creation, we don't have effective economic development. And then I will talk about what should be done, and that a lot of that's going to require a lot more patience than what we currently undertake. And then Rose is going to talk about some future challenges and implications for regional development. So, on that note, I will turn it over to Rose to describe. Before I do, I should know before I turn it over to Rose. One other key theme about our discussion is that, and this is well known, is that too often policy divides rural and urban. That we have, like in the United States, and Canada has a similar kind of policy, is that we have USDA rural development, say at the federal level, and then we have housing and urban development, we have other agencies, and too often rural and urban is divided while we know that rural and urban actually work together in functional economic areas, that people work, shop, play in these regions, where their well-being depends on the entire region, not rural and urban areas. And one of the things that we propose, this presentation being based on a paper that we just published in Applied Economic Policy Perspectives, is that in both countries, instead of dividing policy, rural development and an urban development, we really need a Department of Regional Development. If we actually care about what's happening on the ground, we need a Department of Regional Development where the rubber hits the road. And in that, another lesson is that regions compete globally. We're not, I think that's well known, but what it means for people who do economic development is that it becomes actually more important, not less important, more important to get it right, because at the touch of a mouse, resources can go anywhere in the world. Capital can flow, entrepreneurs can flow, they can go anywhere in the world, and that means if you just get it a little bit wrong, like here in Ohio or in Michigan where we see outsourcing, resources just leave. But if you can be just a little bit right, you attract resources from the entire world. In other words, globalization magnifies the importance of economic development policy. So that's roughly an introduction. I'm now going to turn it over to Rose to talk about a little bit about how regions evolve to kind of set the context for when we talk about policy.
Rose, do you have your microphone muted by any chance? I'm not hearing. Rose, I'm not seeing your microphone icon, and I'm not hearing you. Well, Mark, are you able to kind of fill in a little bit here?
I will fill in
until we get Rose back.
Until I can fill in until Rose is able to join us. Basically, one of the in this is that rural areas and urban areas, say 60, 70 years ago, were really pretty much detached. And that's really how policy evolved, is that we needed a rural and urban policy because rural areas were detached from urban areas. And I think one of our main points is that improved transportation access and communication access connected rural and urban areas. And so thus we see a lot of commuting to jobs, we see accessing urban amenities, we see urban residents going out in the countryside for recreation. We see strong input-output linkages at the regional level, and for these reasons, now regions have greatly expanded. They're much, much bigger in size than what they used to be. And this is just some evidence, though, that that's had profound implications on rural development. And so this is from the province of Saskatchewan, and basically it illustrates that now if rural customers have access to urban areas, that means that that's going to put a lot of pressure on their local community, and illustrates that if they actually want to be viable, they have to work much closely together with urban areas. So in that, this shows from 1961 to 2001 basic kinds of trade centers. At the top is primary and wholesale and retail. That would be in Saskatchewan terms, that's a Saskatoon and Regina. Those are metropolitan areas of nearly 250,000 people. That hasn't changed. But where you see the big change is at the very, very bottom of it. Very, very bottom. That is what we call minimum convenience centers. That was less than half of Saskatchewan. So these would be places that just had like a gas station, maybe a small convenience store of some type. And today, almost over 80% of Saskatchewan's businesses or towns, communities, are these minimum convenience centers, illustrating this major shift away from these small rural communities that were in this web, all the way up to just basically a handful of larger cities. And that's where the jobs are, that's where most of the economic activity. It illustrates this massive change in the Great Plains, and if rural communities are going to be viable, they're going to have to recognize that reality. They can't change that reality, but what they can do is say, hey, if we work more closely with our cities, we can remain viable in that sense. So that's one implication of this. In terms of commuting, this illustrates a commuting map from when a project that Rose and I jointly did for Edmonton, for Canada. And I just want to note that you can barely see there the darker colors, the deep red and the purples, basically indicate that 25 and 25% or 15 to 25 and 25 to 50 and up to 75% of the population actually working in Edmonton. Those little circles are 50 kilometer, 100 kilometer, about a 1 hour drive, or even 150 kilometer drives. And you see just even between 1981 and 2001 how those boundaries of how those areas have become even deeper red and deeper purple, illustrating that the rural communities are very dependent upon the health of Edmonton, Alberta, a metropolitan area of about 1 million people, even out to 100, 150 kilometers away. Point is that we've seen this evolution of regions taking place, and economic activity is taking place in regions. It isn't just taking place in an independent rural community being an island. They're now taking place in regions, but policy is still stuck back in the mid-20th century. This illustrates this in the United States case. I don't want to go through a lot of these, but this Atlanta would be an example where these are U.S. metropolitan areas which are based generally on commuting. What Atlanta looked like in the dark colors in 1950, in the lighter gray in 1973, then kind of that light gray in 2003, illustrating how the geographical footprint of Atlanta has increased. I mean, Atlanta is basically more than tripled in geographical size, and just illustrating how just large sections of northern Georgia are now connected to this region. This illustrates the same in Columbus metropolitan area, where it went from 1 county to 7 counties in its metropolitan area over that 50-year span. And again, that's being driven by commuting patterns. Those regions, that region is now geographically linked to Columbus. And this is Iowa. Again, it's now 5 times bigger. This is Des Moines, Iowa, for a much smaller metropolitan area, about 500,000 people. The point is that across the United States, we're seeing this general pattern of metropolitan areas becoming bigger, much like I was showing you with Edmonton, Alberta. So that illustrates this widening geographical footprint. And this I won't go through all those numbers. People can look at this in context, on their own. But one of the things is it just illustrates that what's being brought into these metropolitan areas are relatively low density areas. They look very agriculture as you get out in the outer areas, but as to be officially added to a metropolitan area, you have to have tight commuting linkages. So the areas may look very rural in the context of its low population density, but they're very tied to the urban area. Yet, as I've already indicated, policy is still being delivered based on population density and based on what the physical environment looks like, not on what the people are actually doing. So regions are much bigger. They're much bigger. You have policy still treating them like a bunch of different islands within their regions. The next one is that they're much more open. They're much more global. So as they're getting bigger, regions are being bigger and more people being tied into a region. Each individual region is being tied to the international economy. They're being much more globalized. And so in that sense, as I've already indicated, that's why these regional policies are more important, because firms are drawing inputs from the entire world, consumers are drawing inputs from the entire, buying services from the entire world, and firms need to be competitive in a global sense. So regions that are not competitive, do not provide the best package, are just going to suffer. So that's why this matters more than ever, getting it right. And basically this slide just summarizes. We have mobile households and firms. Capital can flow at the touch of a button. People are more connected. In particular, the kinds of workers, the knowledge workers, which I'll talk about that being appropriate to the region a little bit later, the kinds of workers are much more mobile. The more knowledge you have, the more mobile you are, both nationally and internationally, increasingly internationally. So how can regions attract those? That's another element that's taking place. So basically, this just reiterates, it's getting it right, that regions are bigger, they're more porous, more attached to the regional, to the international world, so getting it right matters more than ever. So, given that that's the environment we live in, I don't think I presented any surprises there. What does that mean?
Mark, there was a comment from Minnesota.
Okay. And it looks like Rose is also might be, although I just did Rose's section. Let's take the comment from Minnesota.
Yeah, there's a basically down there in the chat box on the topic of rural-urban cooperation, the University of Minnesota in collaboration with Minnesota Rural Partners, recently completed a study showing the linkages between rural and urban communities in Minnesota. So just another piece of evidence on that point.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate, I've seen some of that work from Minnesota, and it's very good at tying that it's not just a link. When we talk about this, it's not just a linkage, say in Minnesota's case with Minneapolis, St. Paul, but also some of its second-tier cities. It's really a nice study. Thanks. On that, so given that that's what's happening internationally, what kinds of policies do we have? This is the part that's the problem. If we want to create jobs, do we have policies that are actually going to help facilitate that? One of the key problems with current policy, and this is a struggle that we all face, it's backward looking. It tends to be very backward looking, that politicians, the media, and public have a view that might even be 2 and 3 generations behind where a natural economy is. So for example, here in Ohio, people still think of Ohio as entirely a manufacturing economy, where if you look at the actual share of employment, it's gone from more than 1 out of 3 people in manufacturing 40 years ago, 2 generations ago, to now barely 1 out of 10. Point is, Ohio's completely evolved. If we go to the Great Plains, the same kind of story can be told about agriculture. These economies have greatly evolved, yet people still think of particular sectors dominating their economies, which might have been true a couple generations ago, but no longer hold any validity, that they've completely evolved. But policy is still aimed at the world of 1950, or too often. The other problem that develops with that is then sectors that were legacy sectors then engage in rent seeking. They just say, hey, we're the most important sector, whether that's still true or not, and they basically engage in rent seeking. And in the sense that because politicians are geographically based, they're tied to their place, they're susceptible to sectoral rent seeking. Now that might be very good for the sector, but as I've already noted, those sectors are now relatively small, and they're not the kinds of policies that are going to help facilitate that. And finally, the other issue involved is that policies are aimed at reducing regional inequities. We have poor regions, rich regions, and so on. Now, that one has to be careful about those policies, but again, sectors come in and engage in rent seeking, say, if you help our sector, whatever our sector is, that'll be good for the region, even though they're usually relatively small shares of that. So that's the first set of problems. The second set of problems... Yes?
Mark Peterson wanted a definition of rent seeking.
I'm sorry. Rent seeking is a term that political scientists and economists often use, where basically individuals or companies or organizations come in and lobby for, usually it's the case where they're lobbying for particular favors from politicians so that they can make more money. So for example, a sector, say, I'm not necessarily to pick on one, but just say the oil industry might lobby for favorable regulations that may not be particularly good for the rest of society, but it's good for their society. They might ask for particular tax breaks, they might ask for low environmental regulations and so on. That's good for their sector and improves their profits, but it's not necessarily good for the rest of the economy. So that is when a particular group, organized group, tries to go in and use the political process to try to extract favors that's good for them, but not necessarily for everybody else. So I hope that helps, Mark. On that, the second issue is, and this relates to policy, is that I've already noted, I think I've noted this, is about 20 years ago, policymakers at least asked experts their opinion. And by that I mean like academic experts among economists or in public policy. Today, we're not at the table. So what's filled this vacuum is that policymakers tend to go to fad-based policy. So for example, back in the 80s and 90s, they were all going to replicate Silicon Valley. Not very many people did that, were successful. Then 10 years ago, the craze was everybody had to be the biotechnology capital. Then we had, for example, say 6-7 years ago, following the work of Richard Florida, well, we have to build beautiful downtowns and wonderful areas to attract creative workers and bohemians, and then we're going to get economic development. And of course, not a lot of research basis for all of these. And then most recently, we had a green jobs craze where everybody was going to create green jobs, even though there were problems that it's a very capital intensive. It doesn't use workers, it uses machines, and in often cases, as I'll talk about, the technology isn't really there yet to support it. That maybe it'll eventually be there, but it wasn't there today. And so we had these fads, no research being used, no evidence base, but we just run to the latest fads. And in this, we're basically picking winners. We're trying to pick winners, and economists are always saying politicians and government officials are terrible at picking winners, and because it requires such incredible knowledge of supply chains and future demand shocks and technology and global conditions. And not only do you have to understand what industry will be hot, you have to understand whether they'll be really competitive in your region. So economists have this long literature of study after study after study illustrating how picking winners has just not been very effective, that it hasn't been a very effective strategy, and yet these fads generally require that politicians are able to do it. In this, they often rely on what economists just really do not like as a rule, tax incentives and various kinds of subsidies. And in our paper, and we're basically using all sorts of work, where it's not just our work, it's a lot of other work that illustrates it's unfair. Basically, governments are cutting deals. Going back to the rent seeking, they're cutting deals for favored groups, but not for other groups. We don't find a lot of evidence that they're successful. We find, in fact, that they're generally not successful. And here, but the real problem is, and this is, I think, well known, if I cut Company A a break, tax break, that means I either have to raise taxes or cut services on everybody else, and that's going to hurt growth. Now, I've had a real difficult time when I speak in public about this, trying to get this across, and one argument I finally found that seems to resonate is trying to explain the displacement, that money could be used elsewhere. It could be used in any other, early childhood education. It could be used in a lot of things that have higher returns. And so, for example, in displacement, I now do an example of, let's say we incentivize an entertainment district. We put in a Mexican restaurant through tax breaks and incentives. Now, that Mexican restaurant might hire 40 people. And the politician and the newspaper and the economic development professional says, we created 40 jobs. However, when I go in as an economist and evaluate whether it worked, I notice, hey, 1 mile down the road, you just put out of business another Mexican restaurant. By creating one, you put out of business an existing one. So you gained 40 jobs, but you lost 40 in the existing one. And because the existing one paid taxes, your new one doesn't, that means the schools have to raise taxes or cut or raise class sizes or something. And you have a family that says who was on the margin. They're saying, you know what, we really didn't like it here. Now we want to leave. So we lost 2 jobs there. The grocery store might now lay off a worker. So when I go in and evaluate it as an economist, I say, hey, the place lost jobs. They're worse off. Yet the politician and the newspaper say they gained 40 jobs. That'd be an example of the displacement we see with these, that they're just not particularly effective, but it's really hard to convey this displacement to people. And I think the reliance on inefficient policy and why picking winners is so dangerous, I think this, unfortunately, we had the Solandra bankruptcy recently, the solar firm that received a federal loan. And, and a host of others, electric car companies going bankrupt, and a whole host of these things that, picking winners, government officials. I'm not saying I could do it either, or economists claim they can't do it either. It just can't do it. Governments don't have the human capital. Wall Street, with much more human capital, with crises on Wall Street and the mortgage market and the dot-com bubble and housing bubbles and so on, they can't do it. Why would we expect a small local economic development shop to be able to do better? Recently, the New York Times had an article from a Freedom of Information request that on the Solandra bankruptcy, that there was an email to Lawrence Summers, who was advising President Obama, and he responded in his email, I relate well to your view that government is a crappy venture capitalist. He acknowledged that, yeah, government's not good at picking winners, but the problem was, and I think this is the real problem, politicians will say we need to be venture capitalists in government so we can offer good tax incentives. The problem is that's the wrong goal. The venture capitalists would have been very happy with the Mexican restaurant who received tax breaks. They've been very happy. They made money. That was the goal. Venture capitalists love to crush the competition. They're not necessarily, they don't care about the displacement. But we who care about communities care about the displacement. So in that sense, acting like a venture capitalist is not the goal. It's because you need to consider the broader economy. It's not just whether your one investment paid off. So let's just briefly on this, because a lot of, especially professionals, have to deal with this. Why do we still have cluster policy? This is something that dates back now a little over 20 years to the work of Michael Porter, which does a good descriptive way of describing cities and how firms work together. And a cluster is basically you have tight buying and selling relationships between groups of firms, and clearly they exist. But the problem is can we use government policy to help clusters? Again, Oracle level knowledge is required to understand the cluster and understand which clusters are on the verge of thriving and which clusters are on the verge of failing. And so systematic evaluation, for example, we cite a book by Durant and et al., two group of very famous urban economists who studied the French policy of clusters, and they basically acknowledge there's a kernel of truth that basically if you double the size of a cluster, say 1,000 workers, you make it 2,000, you get a 2% increase in wages, higher productivity in the cluster. But that's not necessarily the same thing. Here in Columbus, we have nearly 1 million jobs. If we double the size of a cluster, we only helped raise wages for 2,000 workers by 2%. That's certainly not any major shift in the economy. Yet we hurt the rest of the 998,000 jobs. We put them at a little bit of risk because we had to take money from them to subsidize the cluster. The other problem is that clusters can grow and clusters can shrink. We live here where Scott is at Michigan State was the biggest auto cluster in the world. Supporting that cluster would not have been particularly wise if we would have started that in 1970 because it was at that stage of a decline. One of the key predictors, one of the best predictors of how well an industry will do is the bigger it is, the more likely it'll shrink. Big clusters tend to have more competition locally for talent. They bid up prices and wages. Bigger clusters have it through what would be called mean reversion, tend to shrink. And so that holds out statistically. So that's another problem is that clusters can grow, but they can also shrink. Politicians often base it on political power, so they're often helping declining clusters. So again, another suboptimal policy. So one of the things that I think I'm just fascinated by is that, and I keep hearing this, we recently had a big session on this at a conference in Europe where we had a major turnout of the top experts in this, and this is a worldwide problem. Why do politicians still do these kinds of policies when they've been told that they don't work and it's been shown they don't work? And so that's a paper on why do they do these policies? What are they doing? One is they want a quick fix. I mean, politicians are under a tight agenda. They're on a tight election cycle, and they want a quick fix. They want to get reelected. The second one is they want good public relations. And one of the nice things is if I offer a tax incentive to every single company gets a tax break, then they can claim credit for it. They can say, hey, it was our incentives that did it. So anything good that happens, they can claim credit if they give everybody a tax break. The other issue is difficulty in accurately assessing impact. And all of us who work in this have their examples of impact studies that were just wild over exaggerations. Not to pick on this politician, but a local one here in Columbus. Columbus has about 400,000 jobs within the city, about 1 million in the metropolitan area. And it, like everywhere, actually has fewer jobs than 9 years ago, 2002, everywhere in the United States. He claimed to have created, through his impacts, his incentives, 90,000 jobs in that 9-year span. In other words, nearly 1/4 the jobs in the city of Columbus are due to his tax incentives he said he offered. Clearly that's something the public was given that, they may be very skeptical, but they wouldn't have the expertise necessarily to assess that. I think politicians, like entrepreneurs, suffer from something that's called the overconfidence bias and small sample bias. This is from the psychology literature. Politicians, first off, only work in their community. Researchers work across the entire world. We have evidence from everywhere. They're not researchers, they're not scholars. They only have evidence in their own community, and then you put that with overconfidence. That leads to it. The other is principal agent problem. And this derives both the politician and in their economic development office. Politicians are hired by the public to manage the economy, but they are often trying to manage their own reelection. Economic development professionals, the way they're evaluated, if you talk to them and say, how do you get big raises? How do you move on to your next job? Is, well, I cut a deal. If I cut a deal and bring in a big firm, I'm off to my next job. I get a big raise, I'm off to my next job. And so that's the principal agent. And so, and the other problem is they're generally, and this is somewhat as academics, we don't do particularly great jobs of policy evaluation. I mean, we don't get rewarded for it. There's not a lot of grant funding for policy evaluation. It just isn't done very systematically, and thus we have that issue.
Going back a little ways, Saeed had a question about externalities of clusters and whether that would justify more attention to clusters.
Well, here, let's go back. I think that's a reasonable question. First off, that would be the argument that's basically used for all of these economic development strategies, that there's some sort of externality. There's often a lot of supply chain effects, that you're going to build up a big supply chain. All of these tend to have those similar kinds of arguments used. And then when we go back and evaluate, did the places actually, like I mentioned the book by Duranton, they looked at the places where more money was used to develop clusters, and they find very little impact even within the cluster, let alone in the broader economy. And in that sense, it goes back, if we double productivity only 2%, we double the size of the cluster, we only get 2% increase in productivity, 2% higher wages, we can see why we're not going to get a profound impact on the much broader economy. So the externality arguments often put forward as an argument to justify that, but we, as economists, we just don't find a lot of evidence to support that A, that there are large externalities, and B, that policy can actually then, even if there were externalities, the policy actually can then influence it, can identify where we're going to get externalities and then actually positively influence it.
And Mark, if I'm alive, if I could just add to that, just as there may be positive externalities for some new initiatives, if they in fact exist, in the same way that the businesses that have been displaced and shut down because of a focus elsewhere, those businesses will also have externalities and linked industries to them that will likewise suffer on the downside. So I'm not sure that the existence of externalities, either on the cluster we're trying to build up or on the displaced industries, would change the argument.
Right, that goes back to anytime you do a policy, the opportunity cost of displacement elsewhere in the economy is often overlooked. Exactly, Rose. Then the next problem is, and this is especially in rural areas, but you will even see it even at the state level, is that if we can get a big firm, we're going to save our state, we're going to save our province, we're going to save our town. And that's not true. At best, it's a short-term solution. One is big firms hurt the diversity of your community. You're now tied to that. And we have a lot of statistical evidence that says more diverse places perform better than less diverse places. They have deeper supply chains. They're more connected. They're less exposed to one firm closing down. So that's another problem. And also, big firms tend to displace small entrepreneurs. That's another issue. Medium firms do less of that, but big firms displace that, especially in rural communities. Let me illustrate, though, why big firms are not necessarily the answer. We did this over a lot of periods. You can go look at our paper, but this is, and even in the appendix, but this is one example. This graph is, we went to Site Selection magazine. That's kind of the economic developer's Bible. And they list every year the number of big $1 million facilities that were opened up in a state, often with tax incentives, but not necessarily. And then we divide it by people. So basically, you can see Ohio and Michigan, for example. Way out there are states that attract a lot of big facilities. And so does that then in turn translate to faster growth? And so we have all 50 states. What was the intensity of big facilities? And then we put their job growth in subsequent years. They announced the facility. Did they get faster job growth? And we just don't find any statistical relationship there. Regardless of the year, whether we look at before the recession, during the recession, since the recession, we didn't find any statistical relationship. Big firms are just not necessarily the savior. And again, it goes back to if they're funded by tax incentives, we had to take the money from elsewhere to help the company. That means we hurt the rest of the broader economy and hurt diversity. So, given that, what does work? What are policies? And here's the problem I think us people who are interested in economic development have a problem, is that we don't have sexy solutions. We just don't have glamour. We just have, keep your nose to the grindstone, be patient kinds of solutions that the evidence says work, but they're not glamorous. We're not going to go on book tours. And so on. And that's the problem I think we have, is we don't have sexy things. That doesn't mean we lie, but still, one is that efficient provision of government services, that just providing quality government services people value at the lowest possible cost, is important. And in that comes back to regions. When regions are the most effective way of implementing services, we need to do that. I mean, I've already showed you, because now that Rose would have showed you, but I showed you that regions are how we're now organized, and that's how economic development should be done. Policies are often the same way, in the sense that it might make more sense to provide police services and protective services and so on a regional level, so we can take advantage of economies of scale. When that's the case, we need to break down our little local boxes. One thing I want to note. Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, a Paris international organization who looks at these issues, says North America has about the worst local government governance structure in the world. We tend to do it in little tiny boxes, all these little governments, and we have no regional coordination. An advantage they have, especially in China can do it more authoritatively, is they've been able to organize their economy on the basis of regions. I'm not saying we should do a China top-down model. I am saying that's our competition here in North America, and yet we're still using 19th century kinds of governance to try to meet that competition. And we know this, high levels of human capital and knowledge. And so I'm going to try to stress this in a way that I found appealing to the public, not necessarily, I think the listeners know this, but first is, we have to train better workers. I know that's very practical. But second, the kind of people who are interested in how their kids are being educated are also the kind of people we want in our community as workers. And so having good quality public education is also a good economic development tool. And that also requires, and we talk more about this in the paper, is quality of life. That research generally shows that when you look at why the average place grows, not every place, the average place, about half of it is due to having more productive firms, and half of it is because households want to live there or don't want to live there. And so that comes back to quality of life, security, public services, transportation. They're important when delivered in a coherent manner. Again, that doesn't mean just offer public services to offer them, but offer them when they make sense. So why the race for knowledge? Well, one is, and this but I found this is Canadian data. This would be U.S. data. This shows average earnings by educational attainment. Now, the listeners have seen these kinds of graphs, but it really resonates with audiences when they see this. This shows that a high school graduate only made $30,000 in 2009, a bachelor's degree around $60,000, and those with professionals and PhDs over $100,000 on average. I mean, people now often will poo-poo education. Oh, you don't really need it. People aren't learning anything, and so on. And, you know, sure, we can reform education. I'm not saying that. However, if it didn't matter, we wouldn't see firms paying for more educated people. And so that education is still very important. Communities with more wealthy people, hey, they're going to have more funding for public services and so on, and that'll help their businesses. But that's not the end of the story. As people have more education, their likelihood of being unemployed falls. So not only do they make more money when they work, they're more likely to work. So for example, last month, or in September, the typical university graduate only had an unemployment rate of 4%, while those without high school completion were around 14%. So in other words, we're trying to get people who make more money, who have lower unemployment, and the other feature is they're more resilient during downturns. They can find other alternative work. So it's good, okay, good for the individual. I think you would agree. I think you would agree that that's then good for the community. But what the other feature I think this drives the case home, and I actually, this is something that among people interested in regional development, researchers, this is just well known. We don't even really talk about it. But when I presented this in public audiences, that this really resonates with them. I point out there's a large, very sophisticated research that shows that not only individuals with more education are more productive and make more money, but those who are surrounded by people with more education are more productive. Not only is my education important, it's also the education of my broader community. That also increases productivity. And I mean, this is sophisticated research that shows this. It isn't like, you know, as I will jokingly say, people had a few beers and they said, let's try to justify our jobs at universities. And this is related to knowledge spillovers, that we have a lot of knowledge spillovers. When I'm around people who receive more education, I've shown you that it makes you more productive, then I can copy them for best practice. That makes my community more productive. So it's no wonder, in evidence going back to the 1940s, both in the US and Canada, places with more education also have faster job growth and a faster population growth. In other words, places that have more educated workers grow faster for subsequent decades. So then it's a race for knowledge. Basically, taking these patient steps that we got to slowly change the composition of our communities to take advantage of this in the 21st century. Then,
and Bridget Tuck also says they volunteer better too, so that's a good point as well.
You know, and you're Bridget, you're exactly right. I mean, we could go on and on and on, you know, about civic participation and so on, how education seems to facilitate that, and you know, just across the board, how it's important. You're exactly right. So to summarize, communities with more educated population are richer, they grow faster, they have lower unemployment, they're more resilient. How can we do that? I'll just briefly just note that one of the things, I'm going to talk about a Canadian example based on some dreary evidence about the United States. OECD every year comes out with a study of all the advanced economies looking at their level of education. A couple generations ago, the United States stood out as having the best educated workforce. We were so far ahead of the world, it was shocking. Now, the typical 25 to 34-year-old American is about average educated. The rest of the world has caught up to the United States in terms of post-secondary education. Now, we still do okay in university education, but where we really fall behind is at what the United States calls community colleges. That's where we're falling behind. The rest of the world is now recognizing high school isn't enough. We need to be putting people in community colleges. I like the Canadian example because Canada, beginning roughly around sometime in the 1960s, started putting more effort on technical schools and what we call community colleges in the United States, and it's really made a marked difference. They're now ahead of the United States in post-secondary education, well ahead of the United States. This shows, this ties it back into development. This is the province of Alberta, and it shows all sorts of data, but I have rural and small town and urban. And this is why it's appropriate. In cities, it's appropriate to attract research scientists. That's not appropriate in smaller towns. And this illustrates that in small town Alberta, they have about half the population share, 19.9 versus 8 of university graduates, 4-year degrees. But among certificates or diplomas, their terminology for community college or technical college degrees, they're about equal. I mean, it illustrates that they can't get research scientists, but they can bring people beyond high school, and they're doing a much better job, where we're like around 10% in the United States. It can be done. It took 50 years in Canada, but it's the kinds of things that education appropriate. When we talk about it, it's not, we need to recognize places are different, but that it can be done. And I think Canada, in that sense, has had success. Then quickly, before I turn it over to Rose, what are some effective strategies? We talk about the paper supporting entrepreneurship. And in that, the research again supports that small businesses become big businesses. That's the big businesses, what direction? They're only going to get smaller for the most part. Smaller businesses are the ones that get larger. In this current lousy economy, small businesses have not done well, and we're trying to, that would be a reason why we're not doing well. And there's a lot of evidence that if you have a lot of small businesses, you have faster job growth. And in this research, I want to be careful. Yes, small businesses clearly locate in places they think will grow. And yes, that's spurious causation, sure. But this even accounting for that spurious causation, that after even when we adjust for that, we get this growth. So how do we get small businesses? I just want to know, one is this comes back to good governance. If you have bad government, businesses and households know they're going to get tax increases. They know they're going to get all sorts of bad things that are going to happen, and that creates an uncertain environment. While having your act together, like at the state level, balancing your budget so businesses know they're not going to get unexpected tax increases, these kinds of things reduce uncertainty and help businesses. Of course, an appropriate regulatory environment that balances the need to regulate businesses, like we live near a lot of shale drilling, we need to regulate that in an appropriate manner, because if we destroy the environment, I've already noted that you're going to destroy your economy that way. But on the other hand, if we're too tight, we're not going to get, people won't want to start small businesses. And of course, I've already referred to a skilled local labor force, of course, infrastructure. I've already referred to how do we get small businesses to develop. I think the case of Steve Jobs' recent passing is a wonderful example. Steve Jobs was not because somebody incentivized his company. And the same could be said about Microsoft and these others. They weren't incentivized. They're exactly the kinds of companies politicians wouldn't have known about. They were small. These are new technology. They wouldn't have had any idea they existed. Yet incentivizing them would have made them at a disadvantage, and they wouldn't have ever started. So finally, the resulting diversification is wonderful. I've pointed out that small businesses diversify your economy. And again, recognizing externalities, I haven't spent enough time talking about it, though we do in our paper about quality of life and addressing environmental protection. Infrastructure is inherently a regional issue that needs to be addressed in a regional basis. And again, trying to get the public, who will then punish and reward politicians, on this long-term perspective. And again, these aren't sexy, but these are the things that research shows that works, not these very short-term fixes that capture a lot of newspaper headlines, but have been proven to be ineffective and actually add to our job problems. So I'll just finish before I turn it back to Rose, is that, again, the problem with the lack of a sexy approach, that I think people, the listeners, that we don't have a sexy approach, there's no guarantees. We're not like the consultant who comes in and say, pay me money and I'll tell you how to become the next Manhattan. We don't have, this will help your community, your region to thrive, but there's all sorts of things. We don't have the magic bullet. We don't have the silver bullet in that sense. So we just note, though, that hey, even though there's no guarantees, that doesn't mean going back to these silly fads is the way to go. So on that, now that I'm going to turn this over to Rose to talk about what's some strategic long-term issues.
Well, hello everybody, and I'm very glad to be with you. Sorry for the earlier technical difficulties. Thank you very much to Mark for filling in for me in a very capable way. So we have given regions a lot of responsibility and pointed to a set of realities that are pretty demanding. And they're not glamorous, but it's staying the course, getting the basics right, providing the infrastructure, and so on is a very demanding charge for regions. But lest we become complacent, there's more by way of challenges going forward. First of all, the trend of globalization that we have described and spent some time on has driven the evolution of regions in the recent past. It's likely to continue and may even intensify. We see continued improvements in communication and transportation and standardization across borders. Countries that are becoming more connected to the rest of the world through internet access and better trade relationships are going to be part of our reality. More and tighter networks with the rest of the world then are likely, and with that, we will have both more opportunities for successful regions and more exposure. We think this means that regions, and by that we mean policymakers and local economic development staff and local populations, need to be constantly aware and willing and able to adapt to new contingencies. In addition, we need to be aware of and receptive to technological changes that can potentially change the relative competitiveness of regions. The example that we give here is the new technology that made the oil sands competitive. We're very sensitive to that in Western Canada, or shale natural gas here and in the US. But green innovations could potentially erase that. This may be especially important to regions like Western Canada, where I'm from, as well as parts of the US that are benefiting from the commodity boom currently, but that's not like that could very well be erased. Third, then, some parts of North America, as well as Europe, are currently painfully aware that fundamentally more binding budget constraints during slow growth periods can alter the range of possibilities for regions and for individuals. And of course, we do not know how long that slow growth and the accompanying budget constraints are going to persist. On the continuing on then, on our next slide, with additional challenges. There we go. We're still dependent on non-renewable energy sources, and we should not forget about the possibility of $200 a barrel oil. $200 a barrel oil, that's still a possibility. Perhaps it seems like a remote possibility, but it's still out there. And just as some parts of our economy benefit from the current high commodity prices, others will bear the burden. And a significant increase of that nature from where we are now to $200 or in that vicinity would fundamentally alter both transportation and production costs globally and rearrange the location of economic activity. There are also some exogenous forces that we understand a lot less about. And one of these is climate change. We do not have a lot of experience with climate change yet, but we can see that climate change will fundamentally alter the regional attractiveness for households and firms at a rate that we do not understand well. Just as the Sun Belt in the US has served as a major draw for population change over the past 50 years or so, climate change can dramatically again alter the attractiveness of regions as places to live. Agricultural production patterns will shift, and access to water is likely to be a limiting factor, not only for production and for firms, but also for households and for habitation in general. Other places at the same time will find themselves with an excess of water. In this setting of uncertainty, uncertainty at least in terms of timing and uncertainty at least in terms of the degree of impact, regions need to be aware of the potential contingencies and as much as possible try to insulate themselves from those possible adverse effects, and at the same time be flexible and able to adapt to the changes that may occur. So the implications of all this, and I know we've put a lot out there today, but we have shown that regions, especially regions based sensibly on functionally integrated rural and urban components, are the appropriate units of analysis and policy design for global competitiveness. We stress, as Mark pointed out early on, that this rural versus urban, or pitting rural against urban, is not constructive and is not realistic, because it is actually the regions that contain elements of both rural and urban, perhaps urban focal points for economic growth, but large rural areas attached functionally to that urban center. Those regions are the appropriate units of analysis and also the appropriate units for policy design if we want to remain competitive. It should go without saying, but unfortunately it does not, that basic good governance trumps short-term fads for long-term viability and growth of a region. There are simply too many exogenous factors, and increasingly so, to be able to be successful with quick fixes or silver bullets. They simply do not exist. This means, though, that there are payoffs to a broad-based support for innovation and education and training, which will raise productivity and living standards in terms of retention and attraction of a labor force, especially that is suitable to local economy. And in that group, knowledge workers may play a special role. So it's not that we're not leaving policymakers with any options. There are a lot of things that we think will not work, but the basics seem to be our best bet. There are also dramatic exogenous factors that cannot be ignored. Regions very much have to be aware, and maybe increasingly so, of climate change and other shocks that may fundamentally alter a region's competitiveness. Regions should aim through their policies and through their long-term planning and management to be safe havens, recognizing that there are no guarantees of success, but that there are best bets. And I think that's the end of our presentation, and we're here, both of us now, to take questions from the audience or participate in discussions.
Rose, I just want to quickly add that I think all these challenges, we list them. We could come up with a lot of scenarios where the world is literally going to end. Yeah, okay, but we were trying to say that becomes opportunities for those who have their acts together, because the ones who have their acts together are actually going to be even more attractive if we come up with scenarios that the world is ending. So that even makes it more important. So that's why we list those challenges, but also then it really means that communities that have their act together even look even better in that environment.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, thanks.
The stakes are higher.
Thanks for that.
Both to win and to lose.
I think a question that occurred to me as you were talking, Mark, you made a very interesting and important point about, we've got this sort of, the only way I can characterize it is sort of, we're a little bit stuck in terms of the structure of local government that, here in the United States anyway, was designed literally with the horse and buggy in mind, where the county size was essentially determined by in fact, how far one could drive to get back and forth from the county seat in a horse and buggy over the course of a day, so that people could get in and do their business. So we've got this horse and buggy structure out there, and yet we don't seem to be able to update that in any meaningful way. I know that in Canada, the province of Ontario has put in place some measures to encourage consolidation of some of these smaller units, and what are the barriers to doing that here in the United States, and what needs to happen in terms of the political dialogue to become more efficient in some of those things and get more aligned with the regional structures that you're proposing. And while you're thinking of that, I'll just mention too that we do have the evaluation open, so those of you on the line, please look at those questions and answer them. Thanks.
So, Scott, if I'm still on, just a
you
note
are.
on that local governance issue. There are certainly some parts of Canada where they have been able to organize what we now call counties, which are larger areas that make some economic sense. Some parts of Canada, including the one I'm from, that has been less possible, and so we have tiny jurisdictions based on the horse and wagon technology, and we seem to be stuck in that framework. I think that the amalgamation process is probably not something that is readily done in a voluntary way. We have lots of enabling legislation allowing and providing some small incentives to these jurisdictions to join and become larger, more meaningful geographic areas. But the fact of the matter is that the local politicians have little incentive to do so, and lots to lose, and their identity, their power, and their local fiefdom. And it's really a difficult thing, and maybe not possible to do in a voluntary democratic way. It seems to be one of those things that has to be done in, as much as we hate to think of this kind of intervention, but in a top-down way, because that, in the Canadian context, that's really the only way it's ever happened.
Scott, I'll just add that it's going to take significant incentives to do that, to have it look voluntary. And in that sense, let's say we incentivized it, it has to look so clear to voters that the politicians are sandbagging them, that they're going to force the politicians to do it. So it's going to take significant incentives to do it on a voluntary basis. I will say, just to add, that when I lived in Saskatchewan, at the University of Saskatchewan, there was a 1931 publication. It was talking about their little local governments they had, and said, now with all the new technology of 1931, with trains and telegraphs, and even now phones are becoming more used, now it's time that we should start thinking about merging all our local governments. They no longer make sense. And still, 80 years later, we still have that structure. The point is you're exactly right. We need to find ways to incentivize it.
Yeah, I think in Ontario they basically held the local governments a little bit hostage, and the provincial government basically said you're not going to get financial aid unless you actually join up with us. And there have been a couple questions about how to submit answers to the webinar evaluation. If you see the box checked, that's all you need to do. It's being registered into the system when you check things, and then we'll share that back with the presenters after the webinar is over. So sorry about the confusion on that. So and I'm not sure where the political will, or why the political will in Ontario is different or more able to do this. I mean, I can understand why China, has perhaps different powers that we wouldn't necessarily want imposed on the people here by the federal government.
Scott, can I just interject? I think a big difference between these other countries in the United States and to some extent Canada is that they did this because they felt they were behind the rest of the world. Europe has done a lot of consolidation, amalgamation. China did it because they thought they were behind the rest of the world and they had to make serious changes. And the United States has always been living at the top, and thus, in Canada to a lesser extent, but similarly, and thus they didn't feel pressured to do this. And now it's coming that we're going to have to really fundamentally re-examine everything we've done. So I think that would be an example that we're just going to have to go back to reevaluate. We're no longer, especially in the United States, the leader had the lead that we once did a generation or two ago.
Well, and I think there is, on the part of the rural population, the population in general, first of all, a big difference between Eastern and Western Canada, the relative strength and power of the agricultural rural lobby, so that's going to be important. But there's a long recognition lag in the fact that times have changed. I mean, we still hear, and Mark and I have written about this, people looking out the window as they drive through the countryside and seeing open areas, thinking it's agriculture, when that population is no longer dependent upon the rural or agricultural economy, and they're dependent on urban economies. In the same way, it seems to have taken a long time to recognize in some parts of Canada, and surely in the U.S. as well, that the local form of governance, the level of governance we have, is not appropriate to regional economic development in the kind of world that we're living in. And I mean, some part of it is education, and some part of it is offering the right incentives, but the incentives have to be quite powerful to overcome the inertia that's in the status quo, and to overcome the power structures that are out there at the local level.
There are a couple of questions that came in via the chat while we've been talking. Lisa is asking about regional planning land use framework and how that can create a top-down regional regional sustainability plan. So any comments on that?
I will just comment on that, I agree that regional land use policies can be valuable because land use ultimately is very closely linked to economic development. But, and I could be wrong, my sense of the issue is that you have to build public support for this because we're changing governance. It's easier to build public support for economic development in our current jobless, kind of job-hungry environment, and thus the arguments I think the arguments that would resonate for why we need better regional kinds of governments would be on the job creation front, that would make economic development policy more coherent, and then the arguments say, hey, yeah, and if you actually want to help that, then go to land use is also messed up and we do it in small boxes. So I think given the current environment, I think it needs to be done, I think it resonates more on economic development. Though I agree with your point about land use is, of course, a very important element in this.
And I mean, if we're thinking about the top-down versus the locally generated, there are cases where it really is essential to have a framework imposed from a different level of government, because the local communities and regions may not see the forest for the trees, and so some element of that may be a broad framework that is offered by a senior level of government. Within that context, then, once that broad framework is set, then there can be probably a lot more local and regional input into the specifics and particulars of how that's developed.
Brian had a question about industrial policy and kind of basically the resource curse question there. I think in terms of how do you deal with that in economic development.
I'll just quickly comment that the resource abundant regions have historically underperformed other regions. That regions who say that we're going to get ahead based on knowledge outperform resource abundant regions. And there's a long literature, we call it the natural resources curse. We have other Dutch disease. We have all sorts of terms to illustrate that point. I think that in particular is one area of why we're trying to talk about a balance in there. One is knowledge, but two is keeping in mind that your environment is so important to the long term that you can make short-term decisions, that you have resource abundance, you have a lot of shale natural gas, or you have a lot of energy or timber or what have you, and that you're essentially undercutting your future when you do that. So again, communities need to be very careful when they adopt a natural resource driven growth strategy, because on average there's more cases like Nigeria and West Virginia and so on where it seemed to have been more of a curse than there are places like Norway and Alberta where it seemed to have been very successful.
Well, and that's one is the choice of what regional economic development policy we pursue. The other is that when you are blessed or cursed with a natural resource abundance, and that brings in lots and lots of government revenues rolling in for the time during which commodity prices are high, it would then surely be prudent for that government to learn from the biblical story, if not history, that one should save in the 7 good years for the 7 bad years that are most surely likely to come. That use of resources that are government revenues that are rolling in during the good years would be the resources that you could develop to change and diversify your local economy, rather than being dependent forever on that natural resource base. That's a lesson that's hard to learn. We've seen provincial governments in Canada, cycle after cycle, spending everything foolishly during the good times and not having the reserve left during the bad times to stimulate their economy in a more fundamental and diversified way.
Yeah, I know some communities have applied an excise tax where the excise revenues actually go into a trust fund to try to do some of that, with some success and some failures, where the failures being that people get anxious to spend it before it's really needed. Then they also kind of fall into this picking winners issue that you raised earlier of, okay, we're going to have a chopsticks factory, and that's going to save us up here in northern Minnesota kind of philosophy. Well, we're a little bit over our time, and I want to thank our presenters and also everybody who came in today for being with us, and really appreciate your taking the time. It was a very interesting webinar, and clearly you attracted a lot of interest. I think we had about 70 people on the line, so great.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks to all that participated.
Thank you.